Hello, Vivians, and welcome to the third channel. Woo! It's not Halloween, I don't know why I did a spooky noise. And today, you may notice something that you didn't notice in the podcast recording for What We Hear in the Shadows, if you're watching that, is I'm freezing like a robot, but sounding like a nice person, not like a robot, because if you can see, this microphone here is now a prop. I don't know whether I think the cable's disappeared, but it's a prop now because obviously Apple doesn't want to work for me, even with the new software update. But that doesn't hinder me in my mission to be great at everything, especially great at freezing in the good poses instead of bad poses. And so anyway, I've got a brand new interview today with a wonderful guest. He's best known in more voice rather than face, but you'll learn his face over time because there is documentaries and other bits and bobs with him knocking about as Margaret Thatcher in the original Spitting Image, but we'll find out whether he was in the new Spitting Image when Margaret Thatcher appeared, but we'll find that out very soon. It's the one, the only, because there can't be two of him unless he cloned himself, Steve No.
Hello, Steve Nallan. It is.
Nallan.
There we
are.
are.
Sorry, my bad. As you can tell,
many things. When I was working on the Northern clubs, I was because it's actually, you know, people say Nallan. I get that a lot. But when I was on the clubs, I just said, look, it's Alan with an N on the front, just Nallan. So the poor guy got really sort of petrified he was going to get my name wrong. And then he went on the stage and introduced me as, ladies and gentlemen, Steve Valium. Steve Valium. So I'm very happy to be introduced. In fact, one guy forgot my name entirely on a gig I did. He when this happened actually to Jimmy Tarbuck told me this, he forgot the name of Gracie Fields at the Royal Variety performance, and he had to introduce Gracie Fields. And what happens is it's a live show, what was in those days, and he just forgot her name, as you do. And he said, now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome someone who needs no introduction. And that got away with it.
Wow.
But this guy said to me, said, please welcome, and he clearly, I think he was slightly off his head, but anyway, please welcome. So there I am, and Steve Valiant or Steve Nallan or Steve whatever you want to call me, I don't mind.
Yeah, I'm not the best at English. I've come to realise over doing interviews and doing panel shows and all sorts I get up to, I realise I'm the worst person at writing or pronouncing any words ever.
I do hope that maybe you will, maybe you won't. Maybe you, there is one person, I don't know her, but there is one person I know, and I'm looking at a picture of her now. I'll tell you about this later. Well, I'll get it now, actually. Here, you don't know this. I drew this when I was about 16. It's a picture, and it's on my wall. One of the few drawings I've ever done. I'm not an artist, but I found this in the attic, so I brought it out. This is a drawing I did. It is actually Barbara Streisand.
Wow.
And if you ever interview Barbara Streisand and call her Streisand, you think, no, it's Barbara Streisand. You got to do the same Streisand. It's like sand on the beach, you know? Streisand, not Streisand. So there you are. Don't get her name right, or we should get very cross.
She'd be quite old now, wouldn't she?
Oh, she'd be 106. Yes. Bless her.
Yeah. She's a very good singer.
She's a very good singer. I mean, actually, I've been to her concerts and stuff over the years, and she and I mentioned her name to some younger members of my family, and they said she sings. I said, yeah. I thought she was an actress, and they were amazed the fact that she could sing, which is sort of old, I suppose. But there we are. Like you see, life moves on, and you know. what people regard as celebrity one year is, I don't know, somebody completely forgotten the next.
Yeah, and so
You've not asked a question yet, so
no. See, that's how a good interview begins. It begins with enthusiasm and randomness.
the randomness. There's
Yeah, it'll get more random.
oh, good. We like it.
Yeah. So, if for anyone that doesn't know what spitting image is, which I am quite offended, would you be able to explain to them very briefly what spitting image is?
Well, a spitting image is sort of Punch and Judy on television, but with famous caricatures of politicians and celebrities. The first series began on ITV back in 1984. And in those days, it was completely revolutionary. There'd never been anything like that. Puppets were only for children in television terms. Whether that be Tinker and Tucker or Sooty and Sweep or whatever it was. There'd never been a program on television that had puppets for adults. And it was a very adult show because it was on at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night. And it was very satirical. The show got into trouble for impersonating and creating images of members of the royal family. But the main target was the politicians of the day, and of course back in the 1980s that was Mrs. Thatcher and her cabinet. So the show had real sets that were built 2 feet higher than the studio floor. So that basically meant when the puppeteer stood up, I can't really do it on this camera, but basically, you'd be there, and so everything had to be, if you had to move, you had to be 2 feet, the steps had to be 2 feet higher. So they lived in a world of their own with the puppets. So that's a very brief summary of what the show was. And it's now come back after 30 years on BritBox. Slightly different, but principles are the same.
And you mentioned Sooty there, and I saw this thing yesterday where there's one of the original Sooties, I think it's in the Matthew Corbett era, is going for auction for £1,000. You can get an original that's been on the TV version of Sooty for £1,000, which is
about 20 years ago. Roger Law decided to sell off all the puppets that he had at Sotheby's. Some of it was for charity, which I got involved in, and they raised money for that in the Empire and stuff. Anyway, some of those went for about £10,000.
Wow.
I didn't buy one because I knew that they would foam disintegrates, and as does latex. So the foam puppets tended to the bigger puppets because foam is lighter. The latex puppets tend to be little. The disadvantage of the latex is it doesn't move very much. Foam is great. So the Queen was always made of foam because she was very, very expressive. She had a very large mouth and very expressive. The latex less expressive. But even latex, I have one of the puppets upstairs in my attic, but it's in a box now because you let it near sunlight and it becomes brittle and collapses. So anyway, people bought, these things that it's essentially just disintegrated over time. So I never bought one because I knew they'd disintegrate. Not that I had £10,000 to buy. They offered me a puppet, they offered me Roger and Peter said, "Would you like Mrs. Thatcher?" I said, "No, I don't want Mrs. Why would I want Mrs. Thatcher in my house?" Not the full size puppet. I've got a tiny little. They had these days. I've got one over here. This is Ronald Reagan. If I can find Ronald Reagan. This is a doggy chew.
Wow.
So, and the idea was that you threw these at your dog, and the dog, So, and there aren't many left now because obviously the dogs ate them. That's a Ronald Reagan doggy chew.
Wow. And what just wow. And that's a sentence I never thought I would ever hear. One, Ronald Reagan is a doggy chew, and the second of all, the Queen's made of foam. It's sentences you never thought you would hear in your life. But that's just a world of entertainment.
Well, we didn't change the world because actually Mrs. Thatcher kept getting re-elected, so we didn't make any difference whatsoever to her. But what we did change, what satire changed, was a satirist called John Wells I worked with, and he did an impersonation of Dennis Thatcher, and he said that satire, it doesn't change your mind about anything.
Yeah.
It moves around the furniture in your head. You slightly see things in a different way. So you've got the same ideas, the same, but not quite the same way of looking at things. You know, that's what satire can do at its best. But it certainly didn't succeed in getting rid of Mrs. Thatcher. Not that that was the aim. I did ask John Lloyd, our producer, once. I said, "What do you think of this word satire?" He said, "I hate the word satire." He said, "I wish it wouldn't. I wish it wasn't applied to Spitting Image." I said, "Well, what do you think the show is then?" And he said to me, he said, "Well, basically, it's to the rich and famous." And I think that was probably the best description of Spitting Image. I should have said that at the beginning when you said, "What is Spitting Image?" It's to the rich and famous.
Wow. Now, we're going to come back to Spitting Image in a bit, but we're going to go all the way to the beginning, to your childhood. But what program as a child inspired you to become what I like to call an actor or a performer?
I don't know that I ever consciously sat and watched a program that I thought, this is the show I want to. I would now want to become an actor. I think apparently my family told me that when I was very, very young, probably 5 or 6 years of age, I said to the neighbours that I had to go inside now, and I had to, because I was going to go watch Bewitched.
Yeah.
And I twiddled my nose, and I think that was probably my first impersonation, was twiddling my nose of Bewitched. I didn't really start doing impressions until I was a early teenager, probably 12 or 13. But as a kid, I'd always watched everything on the television to do with comedy.
Yeah.
That was my thing. I watched all the comedians. I was less interested in the singers and the dancing, but I loved the comics. And I loved watching films and stories and old films and stuff. And I loved all the old actors that in all the black and white films. I was very fond of the character actors. And actually what I had was, I haven't got it anymore because it's very old. I had a very long scarf, white scarf. And I was been out 5 or 6. And this scarf could be a turban, or it could become a shawl, or it could be a train. And this long scarf would turn into the outfit for all the characters that I played in my head. I didn't vocalize them because I hid behind the couch and sort of acted them out. So that was from about the age of 6 onwards. So, I've never understood where it came from because I have no theatrical background in my family at all. I work with actors and they say, "How on earth did that happen? How on earth can you suddenly just, spend all your childhood with a scarf pretending to be somebody else in your head?" I said, "I don't know. Who knows? Why does somebody look at a mountain and want to climb it? You do what you want to do, and you get good at it, and hopefully there's a profession in it." So I don't know.
Yeah, and it's, for me, when I watch a TV show, I watch it from many different angles. 1, the entertainment. 2, how it's filmed, so I can see if I can recreate it later on. And 3, how they act, because my ambition in life is to become an actor. I'll be posh about it. And I watch things and recreate things. So I have like 8 different YouTube channels, and one of them is a comedy club where I faff about and do silly things like talking to myself, or doing a sitcom where I'm talking to a puppet. And it's from watching TV, all this has inspired me. And that's just what the nation of modern TV is. It's there to inspire a new generation to join the acting world and become performers for a living. And
I was very aware when I was watching people like Laurel and Hardy, and to some degree Charlie Chaplin, but mainly Laurel and Hardy, that they did something I couldn't do. They looked like I couldn't look. And I found the same with some of the actors that I watched in various films that had very strong looks. I have the looks I've got, and I don't have huge eyes or a big mouth, or I'm not bald or whatever. And it's often those actors, those character actors, I was hugely fond of. That are my favourite being a man called Alistair Sim, who people might remember as Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, and I was and also other films, and he was one of the very first people I impersonated as a kid. An odd thing because I think he died in about 1970, but and he was, even then he wasn't that well known in contemporary world because he'd been a big star in the 40s and 50s. But I loved the way he spoke and the way he opened his eyes and spoke, and he often used to act off the lines by making little noises and things like that. And I love that style of acting. It's very, I wouldn't say self-aware, but he knows what he's doing. And he developed his own style and essentially went on doing this all his life. Very fidgety. And famously, and I read about him, and he never did the same take twice. You find actors that want to keep everything fresh, like Alistair Sim, and therefore he would do something different in every take. In one take, he'd pick up a pen or scratch his ear or whatever it was. He'd never do it the same. And there are other actors who always do it the same, but it's brilliantly fresh. So there's two disciplines there, and I'm somewhere between the two. I've been on. If you work with other actors, one of the things you've got to do is learn to adapt to their way of working. Yeah. So one actor I worked with liked to change things live on stage every night, very, very slightly, not fundamentally, just very, very slightly. An actress I worked with absolutely did it word for word, the place she stood, the intonation, exactly the same every night. It was very good, but she didn't like to change it. And therefore you probably should, as an actor, think, okay, well, I won't change what I'm doing with her, but with the other actor who wants to vary it, okay, I can vary it too. Yeah. And then he varies it, and he said he loved doing the scenes with me because I was prepared to do that. The other actress liked doing the scenes with me because I wasn't going to do that, and I was just going to stick to exactly what I did before. So you know, with when there's two or three actors in the same scene, it gets complicated. But that's one of the things I think that there's no right or wrong. It's just you've got to learn people's styles.
Yeah, and you've got to adapt to how they like it. And so you've said it briefly, but how did you get into doing impersonations? So it's because it doesn't seem like just something that normal people would just want to do. How
well, people impersonate their teachers at school. People have we are human beings, and we learn from mimesis, the Greek word for imitation. That's what we learned from, where we get the word mimic from, is mimesis. And we learn by mimesis. We learn, and vocally, people can sound like other people, and I just kept it going. The story, it really was that there was a man called Mike Yarwood who was an impressionist on the television in the late 60s and early 70s. And he was very, very popular. And he did an impersonation of a football manager at Derby County called Brian Clough. And I remember going to school one day and this guy said, I can't do Brian Clough. He was a very nasal voice. I can't do Brian Clough if I hold my nose. And I said to him, well, I can do Brian Clough without holding my nose. He said, how did you do that? I said, I don't know, but I can do it without holding my nose. I don't need to do that, lad. Don't need it. And come and listen to this guy, that does Brian Clough. So so that's, and then I did other characters and stuff and teachers at school. I became very well known for impersonating a maths teacher called Mr. Innes. Outside, outside, lads, get out, outside. No, no. And he used to do this with his head. And people used to love my impersonation of Mr. Innes. And I did other teachers as well. So, but Mr. Innes was the favourite. And when I was in the sixth film, I used to just impersonate Mr. Innes. Outside, outside, which is, just getting the kids outside to the playground was catchphrase, really. But anyway, so no, it was all that sort of stuff. There's an argument about whether or not impressionists are actors or not, and I know of actors who don't rate impressionists as actors.
Yeah.
And the argument is that what impressionists do is all on the surface, and there's nothing revealed underneath. And ultimately, what impressionists do is exactly that. We look at the surface of a character. We just do what they do all the time, and therefore we make it funny. So that the classic example that I used to do years ago is an impersonation of a racing horse racing commentator called Peter O'Sullivan. And what impressionists do is you take that voice and you apply it to something else. So and we're coming up to the final furlong now, and it's pitching for more than it. And then you find a sketch where and I turned it into a restaurant sketch where he was describing the eating of a meal. And we're under starters orders now, and they're off. They're definitely off. And I turned it into a restaurant sketch, which I can't hardly remember, but and it's and the wife's wine glasses are full of there. All sort of things we do. Anyway, that's what you do. Though I can't remember the script now. But of course, Peter O'Sullivan, who I met, doesn't speak like that in real life. Yeah. But what you're doing is you're taking that sound that somebody has, that way of speaking, and you apply it to somebody else, you get a sketch out of it. But you never get below the surface of what Peter O'Sullivan is like, because it's pure surface. Nothing wrong with that. But some actors think that because you do that, you can't do anything else, that you can't therefore get below the surface. Yeah. And I don't think that's true. I think you can. But that is what acting is about, is revealing what is below the surface. I don't take a great... to be honest, most people can't act, are actors. I'll be honest, they can't do it. They're not very good at it. I've sat through too many plays in too many theatres and watched too many things on television and too many films. Most people can't act. Judi Dench can act. She just says it and it's brilliant, and it's very real. It's very in the moment. Most of the big movie stars can do that. That's because that's what they're good at. But the very few. I mean, I've sat in so many shows at the RSC when actors come on and they act like this and they've got the voice and it's a brilliant voice, but I don't believe a word of it. Yeah. That's my view. So I keep auditioning for various things that I never get, but I won't tell you who it's for. But that was a television show I auditioned for, and I said to them, I never want to play a policeman or a lawyer or anything like that that's got 6 lines. There's no point, because I'd be terrible at it. If you ask me to be myself, I can't do that. I can't act as myself. If you give me a character that I can develop, then I can act and make it real. Yeah. But I'm not unable. But I've sat in voiceover studios and they say, could you do it like yourself? And I say no. Or I've been into auditions and they say, could you make it more like yourself? No. And they really get offended. No, we want you to do that. I say, well, I'm the wrong actor for you. No point. I can be somebody else. I can make that real, but I cannot be real as myself.
Yeah. And so you're most famous for doing the UK president. I don't think anyone's ever a president in the UK. The UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Now, how did that come about? How did you like develop the
Well,
voice?
listen, Mr. Mason, why don't you ask her a question? Eh? Ask the UK's former president, Margaret Thatcher, a question, and I'll answer it. And then you'll see what I mean when I can be real as somebody else, but not myself.
How are you? What was it like working in Parliament?
Oh, goodness me, you know, Parliament itself is a very, very large building. You have the House of Commons, and then you have various offices. It's very much like, they call it a palace, it isn't. There's rather a lot of leaks there and so on. Leaks in different forms, I may add. But you know everybody. It's like people compare it to being at school. I never went to that sort of public school, but I understand what they mean, because Parliament is a place where everybody has known each other since they were very, very young. I went to Oxford. Did you go to Oxford, Mr. Mason?
No.
No, I thought not. But if you went to Oxford or Cambridge, and that tended to happen in those days, one had known these people from a very, very young age. And so that was very interesting, you know, the different personalities. I often, you know, admired people who disagreed with me. People said, oh, she is in charge of her cabinet and they're all yes men. No, that is not what I wanted. I wanted people to disagree with me because I wanted the argument. I wanted the cut and thrust of politics.
Brilliant.
See, I made that up. I had no idea what I was saying. It's not, you can decide whether it was real or whether it was pure surface or whether there was a sense of a real person underneath all that. Some people would say, oh, well, it's just an impression. Other people say, well, it was very real. Who knows? You know.
Yeah. And so because I found out a few weeks ago, because me and my dad are big fans of both Smiths Images, new and old. And we found out that Margaret Thatcher was quite actually chuffed with her own version of Smiths Image, and she.
Well, goodness me, there you had Smiths Image portrayed me as a strong, dominating leader who knew what she wanted. Well, what is wrong with that? Goodness me, they were doing me a favor in a way, weren't they? The person I felt sorry for was Neil Kinnock, who was a buffoon. And that is what was so striking about that program. In many ways, they got it right, because I was strong. I was confident. I believed in what I was doing because I was a conviction politician, whereas the opposition, with Mr. Kinnock, who is over there portrayed as a clown. I shall get him for you and prove the point. Because Mr. Kinnock was a clown. And that is how he was seen, and quite rightly too. And if you look very, very closely on the camera, his nose is the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Mr. Roy Hattersley, who was the one who did all the spitting, whose voice was also done by Mr. Steve Nallan. Well, that's perfectly correct. But can I just correct what Mrs. Thatcher said? Mrs. Thatcher was not necessarily a strong leader, because a strong leader is not necessarily the same as a good leader. And a good leader listens. Mrs. Thatcher actually never listened. She would argue, of course she would, she enjoyed arguing, but she only argued so that she could defeat those who were against her. So she called herself a strong leader, and possibly that may well be fair, but strong isn't necessarily good. And I think under the Labour Party, if we'd been in power in the 80s, we'd have had a better government than the Tory government that we had. Anyway, so you had that. Just made that up as we went along as well.
Brilliant. And so with Smiths Image being popular, and then because I feel like when before he even said he was coming back, I've had several conversations, not on purpose but by accident, saying how it would work now. So what's your thoughts on the BritBox era of Spitting Image?
Well, I'll be perfectly honest with you. I haven't seen it. I don't have BritBox. So the only things I have seen are the sketches that they put on Twitter and occasionally on YouTube. I was in one last year. They brought back the Ghost of Mrs. Thatcher, and it was a Halloween episode, and I did it actually. I think I did it on this microphone. I can't remember now, but just outside here. I enjoyed the sketch that I was in. It was great. It was actually, bizarrely, it proved one of the most popular sketches of the series. Boris Johnson taken over by the Ghost of Mrs. Thatcher. There was a very clear joke. There was some good gags with Gove getting terribly excited, the prospect of talking to Mrs. Thatcher, shall we say. So I enjoyed it. I haven't really seen enough to make a comment. One thing I would say is that the sketches are a lot longer than anything we ever did back in the 80s.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that is. I mean, John Lloyd, our producer, always used to say, look, if a sketch is longer than a minute, it has to really justify itself. It has to be a really, really good sketch to justify itself going over a minute. So I can't really say whether or not all the sketches on Spitting Image, the new version, are justified. I've seen some great caricatures, the Gove puppet particularly. So not the first time caricaturists do this. And the writers are the same people that are writing, very good comedy. So there's some good gags. Yeah. The argument that people have put, oh well, we don't have the politicians that we used to have, or that Boris is a satire himself, and so was Trump. I'm not quite sure that's true. I think that we were very lucky in having Reagan, who you could argue was a satire in himself, Thatcher, who was arguably a satire in herself, Gorbachev. So we had three leaders at the time across the world that were great, strong leaders.
Yeah.
When Spitting Image moved on, we then had George Bush, John Major, and Yeltsin. Less interesting. So, you are to a degree dependent on the leaders that you had. So Spitting Image in its prime was very lucky with the people that they had in power.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen any major sketches with Biden. I didn't really. There was a sketch I did see last year, very briefly, but it had mainly about Barack Obama, and I didn't quite understand what the Biden angle was.
Yeah.
And I don't know enough about modern American politics to make any comment. And also, I spoke to Roger. I met him on the train, and he said, "We're doing Spitting Image." I said, "Roger, I'm too old." And I said, "I haven't done a new impersonation for 10 years. I just something I just haven't done." And oddly enough, when you get to 50, you are unable to do them.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I won't name names, but there are other impressionists that I've spoken to, and they say, I can't do them anymore. I don't know. My brain doesn't seem to. And Mike Yarwood, back in the 70s, the same happened to him. He got to mid-50s and he just couldn't do impressions anymore. And I just gave up and went into acting and other things instead. So the last good impression I did was Anne Widdecombe, who's disappeared anyway. She was a British politician, quite right-wing. And she had a really interesting voice, though, which was, I'll do it, and you'll, even if you don't know who she is, you'll find the voice interesting. She had a very interesting voice, and it was rather like having two notes at the same time, and it was rather domineering, and rather not suffering fools gladly. And actually, whether you know, it's a great voice, actually, whether you know who she is or not. And I met her once, and she's a tiny little lady, and it was at a function, and a friend of mine introduced me and said, Anne, come and meet Steve, who does an impersonation of you. And she said, well, then let's hear it. Let's hear it. So I said, well, Anne, she was very nice, very nice to me. I said, well, Anne, you've got a habit in your voice of actually having two notes at the same time, which is very difficult to do. I said, you've got two notes happening at the same time. You've got a high note and a low note almost operating simultaneously. And she said, yes, I have. And I said, do you know who also has that same aspect to their voice? She said, well, I'm sure you're going to tell me. And I said, yes, I am. The person who has that same aspect to their voice is Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson from The Simpsons has the high and the low operating at the same time. And you can hear the same note, the high note and the low note operating at the same time, Marge. Yes, you can. She had no idea who Homer Simpson was. She looked at me completely blank and said, wow. That's very interesting, and walked away.
Yeah. Oh, no, I don't know.
That was really, I did a show once, and I put Homer Simpson in it. And I couldn't do the voice, and I had to do the show. It was a tryout, so it was a tryout for Edinburgh, and I was trying it out in January. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't do the voice. And so I said, look, it's a tryout. Nobody was paying to see the show. It was just invited audience. And people said to me, your Homer Simpson was terrible. I said, I know. I just haven't had the time to work on it.
Yeah.
They said, it sounds like Fred Flintstone. Don't put it in the show, Steve. Don't put it in the show. I said, well, I'm going to put it in the show. And the print, it's already printed, and the poster has gone off. Right, okay. And then I had to do the impersonation. I had to learn to do it. And it was very difficult, but it took me weeks actually to get it right. And then I think it turns into it's not one of my best voices, but it's certainly not too bad. Ooh, raspberry flavor. Ooh, Marge. And the other thing I did was I did the same with Robin Williams.
Yeah.
So Robin Williams, who I've been a fan of since Morecambe Mindy back, when I was a teenager. It was my first knowledge of him. I think it was Morecambe Mindy, or might have been Happy Day. Anyway, listen. So anyway, I put it at the top of the poster.
Yeah.
The show I did. So I had to make myself do Robin Williams. And the thing about Robin Williams is that he is a very, there are certain characters that have a singular side to their voice. Let me think of a good example. Anne Robinson. You just talking like that is very Anne Robinson. Just very, very ordinary. Who else? Or Mr. Oliveira in Harry Potter, John Hurt. John Hurt has a high, very floaty voice. He did. What's the line in Mr. Oliver? It's the wand, Mr. Potter. The wand chooses the wizard. It's all of that. And that's what he does. Brilliant. Yeah. And Ian McKellen, he's very bumbly. So Ian McKellen has Gandalf bumbly all along and bumble, rumble. So you find that aspect of all these voices. Maggie Smith as, what's her name? Professor McGonagall. She's what you call a flicker. So, yes, flick. Oh, Mr. Potter. She's constantly, as it were, flicking with her voice, flicking things off the dust and so on. And she's not a bumbler, she's a flicker. The problem with Robin Williams, he's all of those. His voice changes so much, and so I had to wander around the house finding first his rhythm. So I wandered around, and I really kid you not, it's about a week trying to the constant changing rhythm that he has in the voice. And then you vocalize it. Oh yes, you are. Just find the tone of the voice. Oh yes. Oh, but it takes a while. You know, it takes a while. Yes, Mr. Tom, it takes a while because he's changing that voice. Oh, nano. Yes, good morning, Vietnam. Oh yes, we're rock and rolling now, my friends. Yes, carpe diem. Seize the day, boys. Seize the day. Yes, I said that in Dead Poets Society. Have you ever read any Dead Poets? Does anybody leave our live poets? I don't think so. So anyway, many years since I did that, but you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Constant and the concentrate. And you know, a real comic genius, and who could just do, you know, an hour of impro and all the rest of it. But he, as a voice to do, very exhausting and constantly changing. So he's the only one that I know that has that characteristic. Most people have a line in which they move, and they learn that particular vocal technique. But he was very difficult to do because of the different voices.
Yeah, and with Spitting Image having a range of cast members, what was it like working with Chris Barry and Steve Coogan? Because you worked with them, and
odd enough, in a way, Chris Barry did the first few series, and then Steve Coogan came in because Chris Barry left to do Red Dwarf. So actually, it was interesting working with Chris, because Chris has established certain ways of doing Kinnock, and then when Steve Coogan came in, he slightly wanted to do it in a different way.
Yeah,
I'm not going to choose between the two, but Steve was. I mean, you could just see in Steve the talent, and what he wanted to do, which I wasn't quite interested in the same thing, and he has a lot more successful career than I have in that sense. He wanted to do characters. In fact, he came in one day with a load of 10x8s, which are basically black and white photographs that he'd had done. And I said, "Who's this?" He said, "Oh, this is a character I want to do called Alan Partridge." I said, "Oh, right. And who is this?" He said, "Oh, well, it's based on a sort of a TV interviewer who thinks he's slightly more important than he actually is." I said, "Is it based on anybody?" He said, "Oh, yeah, it's based on a guy called Fred Dinage." I said, "Oh, I remember Fred Dinage from How, television series in the 1970s. Where it was How, you know, it was a science program for young children about how do you do this." I said, "Oh, I remember Fred Dinage. Yeah, he works at Anglia now." And so anyway, but so that was the birth of Alan Partridge. But he was, you know, Steve was very, and as was Harry Enfield. But what I had no interest in, and I still don't really, except maybe one or two, is actually creating a character.
Yeah.
I'd much rather get a script that, you know, there's a character in the script and create the character from the script, as opposed to create a character and then write a script.
Yeah, and drawing near the end of this wonderful interview, now one of the most popular things that I think still is still knocking about, well, I sort of tell everyone about it, is when you did the chicken, I think it was called the Chicken Song. I'm not 100%.
Yeah, the Chicken Song. Well, that was because what they did on Spitting Image, we worked on it for about maybe 3 or 4 weeks before the series went out, and these were what they called banking sketches, and they were basically songs that took a long time to film, sometimes 2 or 3 days to film. Yeah. And the banking sketches could go in any show. There was a big song, yeah, and it wasn't topical. It was purely a silly little song, and they needed these because they couldn't record a half an hour every single week, yeah. So they needed these banking songs. So what the producers recognized was the puppeteers, and I was a puppeteer as well as a voice actor. The puppeteers were singing this song all the time, even though we finished the recording. and it's an eel. I think it's called an earworm now. They're called the earworms, where there's a tune that just catches in your ear and it sort of just lives inside. So I'm hold a chicken in the air, stuck a deck chair up your nose, da da dee da da, and then bury all your clothes, da da dee da da, and it was really, really catchy. So, and then it went out, and it worked on the viewers, and then we ended up. One of the things I have no bucket list in my life particularly, but one of the bizarre things that I thought I would never end up as was appearing on Top of the Pops on a #1 single. I just thought that was just, you end up doing certain things in your life, and that wasn't one I ever expected when I was 12.
You
But it was great fun.
Ooh, I'm now at #1.
We're now at #1. Yes, it was very bizarre. It was very silly.
Do you reckon Margaret Thatcher heard it? Do you reckon she listened?
I don't think it would have been. I don't think it would have been on her desert island discs as a song, particularly. No. Probably not.
Who knows? And
it was based on a group that used to do these novelty songs. They don't really do novelty songs anymore, but in the 60s and 70s there were what was known as novelty songs, and sometimes these used to be very popular. They often at Christmas you used to get songs about grandmas and granddads that suddenly went to #1, because if you had a song about granddad particularly, which Clive Dunn did, every kid bought the single to give their granddad the record Grandad, and it went to #1 over Christmas. So you often got these sort of novelty records, and my favorite ever was a song by Benny Hill called Ernie.
Yeah.
Ernie, who drove the fastest milk cart in the West. Ernie, and he drove the fastest milk cart in the West. And it's still probably the greatest of all novelties. And if you've never heard it, just type in Benny Hill Ernie. It's very funny, and it's a great little catchy song. And nobody expected this song to catch on, but it did. And same with Chicken Song. It was great fun.
Yeah. And I found this. Watched this video recently of Boris Johnson discussing his spitting image character, and how he was a little bit disappointed how the character didn't look. It looked a lot more like I can't remember who. I think it was like someone from ABBA. Looked more like someone else, and he was a little bit. He said, "Oh, go back to the drawing board." Because
I like his hair. I think his hair is a sort of moppy thing.
Yeah,
I think that's quite funny. I think he looks like him. Matt Ford, I think, is the impressionist, very good impressionist who's doing the voice.
Funny.
I suppose what I always said about Margaret Thatcher was that, which I do think is possibly slightly different in the approach nowadays, is I'm sat here, and this is the way perhaps Margaret Thatcher would be reacting to you in an interview situation. And this is the way she may well have spoken. But this isn't a very, very good caricature of Margaret Thatcher, because I've got one over here, if you allow me to get it. The caricature of Margaret Thatcher doesn't quite match. The caricature of Margaret Thatcher doesn't quite match. My voice doesn't quite match the puppet. It's too soft and gentle. And therefore, what I had to do in the vocal side was take what you may call the basis of the Margaret Thatcher voice and add a harder aspect. And in the House of Commons, Mrs. Thatcher had the harder voice. The right honourable gentleman does not understand the nature of fiscal policy. So what I did was I took that harsher House of Commons voice, and then I put it in the when she's doing it. Oh, you imbeciles have done it again. And so there was an element of caricature in the voice, and so that's how she spoke all the time. It was somehow between her interview voice and the voice she did in the House of Commons. But that's not how she sounded. She never spoke like that. But it fitted what she looked like. And there was a character, my favourite character was a character called Robert Romsey, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, archbishops and vicars,
They speak very slowly because they are giving sermons and they have their sermon voice.
which is terrible for a puppet because it would be too, it'd speak too slowly. So I'll do it. I'll get the puppet for you. I've only got one spitting image puppet,
Yeah.
and it's the one that doesn't disintegrate. It's the cat. So it looks alive when it's looking for something. It never. If you just do that, it looks dead. And as soon as it's focusing on something, even the camera, that's how you keep a puppet alive.
Yeah.
So if you let it do that, it just sort of dies. It's dead. But if it's looking around, so I'll show you what I mean. It's too slow.
We say today that it is important.
You see, that would kill a sketch. It's far too slow. So the producer said to me, Steve, it's a great voice. You've got a great impersonation. Useless for the show. Useless. So, and this is the best note I ever had in an actor. He said, can you take that voice and make him 7 years of age? I said, okay. He said, we just need it faster and we need element of naivety in it. So can you?
So I took the slow sermon voice and speeded it up, and it was much quicker, and he sounded much younger, and then more excitable. He was much funny,
and it sounded nothing like him.
Wow.
But it worked for the caricature. So that's what spitting image was all about. Sometimes it wasn't about an accurate impersonation of somebody, but it was an accurate representation of the puppets, because the puppets were the stars of the show. And we often had, I won't mention, we had a very famous impressionist came onto the show, and he never was invited back because his impressions were too accurate. They didn't want that. They wanted somebody who could mold the voice to the puppet. And sometimes it took a while, to get that right.
Yeah.
And so I think the best people for the show were the people that were able to operate as caricaturists as well as impersonators.
Well, to wrap up this wonderful interview, a question that I never thought I would ever ask is, what are your hopes for the future in your career?
Oh, well, we live in hope. That's one of the. Actually, hope is the worst thing an actor can have in their life, frankly, because actors always live in hope of the job that will change that. And I'm still doing it. I auditioned recently for relatively recently for a big television show, and they said to me, "Oh, we like you. We think you're good, but you're not right for this part. But we know the part that you can play, if and when it comes up." So I've been waiting by the phone for the past couple of years, waiting for the call to come and join this series, and it never came, and it may never come. So my hope is that I accept the fact that all hopes may not actually happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on and let me interview you. Now is your time. If you need to or want to promote anything, now is your time to promote anything you've got upcoming or anything you want people to look out for in the future.
Maybe next year I can come back and we can talk about something else.
Ooh.
Because I am currently writing, and here it is. You are the first person to see this.
Ooh.
And it is a history of time travel in books, television series, and comic books.
Wow.
Dating back to 1700 right through up until current series on Netflix today. And so I'm writing a history of time travel in movies, television, and novels.
Wow.
And not only, I'm also covering what you could call the philosophy of time. What is time? The science of time travel. What is a wormhole? What is that the same as an Einstein-Rosen bridge? You know, you see these time travel movies and they say, oh, it's, you know, I've created a wormhole. Why do we like time travel films? If we do, what's a time window? What you often have in time travel stories is a way of the people in the future seeing what's happening in the past.
Yeah.
You have a thing, I call it a time window. And often it is a physical window. Time tunnel has a screen. But there's a Korean series called Alice, and their time window is a drone that looks like a giant butterfly that floats around taking pictures. So all time travel stories, if they need to see in the past, need a way in which they can see into the past through a camera or whatever it is. So I found this as I'm going through the history of it, you know, the same problem keeps reoccurring of how, if it's set in two time places, how one sees the other. And also how, if you're in the past, how do you know that your actions are going to change the future if you're not in the future? And in Quantum Leap, this was done by Al, who was a sort of hologram with a computer. And other stories do it in different ways. Back to the Future, they do it in a photograph. You know, the photograph in Back to the Future, the 3, 4, and of course, when the children disappear, his family disappear, he knows he's not changing the future, and when they come back, he knows he has put the future back as it should be. So all in a series called Timeless, something similar happens. There's a coin that has JFK on it, and for a brief moment when things go wrong, that has Richard Nixon on it. And then it changes back to, I think, JFK. So there's always needs to be that means. So I'm putting this together. Why I am putting this together, we can talk about next year.
Yeah. Well, that will be very exciting. It sounds very interesting because, you can probably...
Well, what I'm writing, which is called Telling the Tales of Time, which people can make a note of, Telling the Tales of Time. It will have free access on the internet, on an internet site, not my own site actually, but on an internet site by the end of the year, hopefully.
Wow.
But I can't tell you any more about it because it's connected to another project. But there's a reason why I've written this, and the reason why I'm giving it away. I'm not selling it. I'm not going to make any money out of it. I am basically going to put it on the internet for free. And it's approximately 95,000 words at the moment.
That's a lot of words.
It's a lot of words. And it's been very instructive for me.
Wow.
And I've enjoyed doing it. Look, I'm still doing it because these are my notes on a series called Alice, which is on Netflix at the moment. It's a Korean series about time travel. So I'm currently, which I've been doing since 6 o'clock this morning, before we even started talking at 9, I've been writing about the series Alice, the Korean time. That's what I do on a Sunday morning. Write a history of time travel and Korea.
Time travel is amazing because my biggest passion in life is my room says it all, but Doctor Who. And now that's a time travel program that doesn't always get time travel correct and says words that sort of don't link and mess up.
Well, it's. I mean, we could talk forever about Doctor Who, and of course, in the article that I've 90,000 word long article, it's almost a PhD. I spent a lot of time, talking about Doctor Who, but not exclusively about Doctor Who. I mean, that's the thing is that Doctor Who is. But I talk about the what I call time beings and how you create a time being, and how and all the rules are different. he does it in his TARDIS. That's his portal. Ted and Bill's Excellent Adventures do it in a telephone box, which of course is a great tribute to the TARDIS. There's always the question, which I find interesting, about whether or not when you time travel, you take your clothes with you.
Yeah.
For convenience, most people, when they're traveling a wormhole or whatever they choose to travel in, a wormhole, incidentally, is technically possible mathematically, but it's not technically feasible in our universe. You could have a universe that allowed for a wormhole, but it's not ours. Yeah. It's not possible to have a wormhole. So when they say, "Oh, it's a wormhole," no, it's not possible. But certain time travelers travel with their clothes. Most do. But I can give you two examples of time travelers who do not travel with their clothes. One is in the Terminator. He travels naked.
Oh, yeah.
Because they decide, and that's great, because he arrives naked. He's got to find some clothes. It's a great scene, both for Schwarzenegger and also the guy that's going back. And another one is the time traveler's wife.
Oh, yeah.
Time traveler in that, because with the time traveler's wife, or the time traveler himself, it's a genetic problem he has. They decide that his time traveling ability is genetic.
Yeah. And
therefore, obviously, he can't take his clothes if the time travel is produced genetically.
Yeah.
With the time travel machine in Terminator, which I don't think we ever see, it's established that they can't take their clothes with them.
Yeah.
So when you're creating time travel rules, what I say is that it doesn't matter what they are, but be consistent. And maybe you, as a Doctor Who fan, can go through the nearly 60 years of Doctor Who. I think it is 60 years, actually, and finding consistencies there. Because obviously, over that 60 years, what was time and so on was changed, and what the rules of the TARDIS changed, and so on and so forth. So I talk about this in great detail, but not just about Doctor Who. I talk about I don't know. Let me think. I talk about all sorts of. Obviously, talk about Back to the Future. I talk about Star Trek, because they did some time travel in Star Trek. I also talk about Time Machine. The original.
Yeah.
H.G. Wells, and something called time dilation.
Yeah.
And time dilation is an argument that comes up in the time machine itself. Is the time machine physically there when it goes into the future? So if you put your hand where it was, should you be able to feel it? If you go back in time, there's a problem called the Cheshire Cat problem. Is it there or isn't it when it goes into the future? The bigger problem when a time machine goes into the past is double occupancy, because if it's traveling into the past in the same space, it is going to immediately crash into itself. This is not the problem with the TARDIS, because the TARDIS travels in time and space.
Yeah, it does two things in one.
But here's the problem. You see, we've started the interview 6 months too early, but you've got me on the subject. Here is the problem. So, if it travels into the past, and an object travels into the past in the same space, it's going to crash into itself in the past because it was there 3 minutes ago.
Yeah.
So, if this microphone travels into the past, it's going to crash into itself because it was there in the past. Slightly different position, but it's in the same position. Here's the thing. The Earth is going around the sun.
Yeah.
The space is changing. The sun is spinning round the universe, the solar system, which itself is spinning around the universe. So actually, the physical space that this is in may seem to be the same, but actually it isn't.
Yeah.
So, and with all these, arguments about fascinating, and the grandfather paradox, Do you know about the grandfather paradox, which is basically you go back in time and you kill your grandfather? Does that mean you stop existing?
Yeah.
If you stopped existing, that means you didn't kill your grandfather because you didn't exist to kill your grandfather.
Yeah.
And I think it was somebody, I think it was somebody like Stephen King who basically says, who wants to kill their grandfather? So that solved the problem by saying, don't kill your grandfather. In fact, there's a time travel program that basically says you can go into the past as long as you promise not to kill your grandfather.
Yeah.
So there's the grandfather paradox, which I talk about at enormous length. There is causal loops, which you'll know possibly from Red Dwarf, and famously there's several in the Star Trek when they go back and save the whale. There's a couple of causal loops where the thing that is invented is never actually invented. It was there in the past, it comes to the present, and aluminium, the thing that he creates, it was never created because it was there in the future. He brings it to the theory brings to the present, but nobody ever thought of it.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's just a causal loop. And then there's time loops when people get stuck in a time loop. Classic one being Groundhog Day. Anyway, there is a preview.
But anyway, we'll talk about that when the time comes and we can talk about it more.
When the time comes.
When the time comes. No ironic joke there. But it's now time to end the interview so that it can end and that it's never timeless. That's a pun there that wasn't very funny, like most of my jokes. But anyway, guys, thank you guys for watching. If you want to see more of me, I'm here. I'm not going to move. Yeah, because I'll never move. And come back to the third channel next Friday for something very special. Can't say too much because it'll ruin the specialness. And it's special because I like the word special. But thank you guys for watching, and thank you, Steve, for doing this.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you.
And time on, time out. Bye. Satty bye.